The cabin smelled of fresh leather and expensive cologne. The quiet murmur of first-class passengers filled the air as flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisle, offering champagne and warm towels. The atmosphere was one of exclusivity, of quiet luxury, until a shift in energy cracked through the illusion. A stewardess named Margaret stopped in her tracks, her sharp eyes locked onto a young boy, 12, maybe 13, sitting comfortably in seat 3A. He was small for his age, but sat with the confidence of someone who knew he belonged there. His sneakers, neatly tied, barely touched the floor. His hands rested on the armrests as he flipped through the in-flight magazine. Margaret pressed her lips together, then took a step forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice controlled, measured. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The boy, Noah, blinked. He glanced up at her, then back down at the boarding pass in his hand. "Yes, ma'am. Seat 3A. Margaret barely glanced at the ticket. Instead, her eyes narrowed. "This is first class." A few passengers nearby glanced up, sensing the tension. Some quickly turned back to their tablets or newspapers, unwilling to get involved. Others watched, curiosity flickering in their expressions. Noah felt a strange pressure in his chest. He wasn't new to people second-guessing him, but something about the way she stood, arms crossed, lips pursed, made his stomach tighten. "My dad booked this seat for me," he explained, his voice steady. "I'm traveling alone." Margaret exhaled sharply, placing a hand on her hip. "There must have been a mix-up," she said, her tone firm. "This section is for first-class passengers only." The words hit like a slap. Noah wasn't stupid. He knew what she was implying. He belonged in first class as much as anyone else here. His dad made sure of it. He had the ticket. The seat was his. But suddenly, none of that seemed to matter. He hesitated, fingers tightening around the armrest. "You need to move," Margaret continued, her voice louder now. "Come on, let's not make this difficult." Noah's throat burned, but he refused to let his voice shake. "This is my seat." Margaret sighed, an exaggerated dramatic sound. Then without another word, she reached into the overhead compartment, grabbed his backpack, and set it in the aisle. Noah felt his face flush hot. A few passengers shifted in their seats, watching. A man in a business suit cleared his throat but said nothing. A woman glanced at her husband, then looked away. No one spoke up. No one asked questions. Noah swallowed hard. He could argue. He could fight. But he could already feel the weight of silence pressing down on him. The longer he sat here, the more eyes he felt on him. The judgment, the assumptions. So without another word, he stood, grabbed his backpack, and stepped into the aisle. Margaret didn't offer to help. She just motioned toward the back of the plane. "This way." As Noah walked past row after row of first-class passengers, shame crept up his neck. He wasn't sure why. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had his ticket. He belonged here. So why did it feel like he didn't? When he reached economy, he sank into an empty seat near the back, the space feeling smaller, tighter, different. He exhaled slowly, gripping his phone as his fingers moved over the screen. "Noah, they made me move to the back. Said I couldn't sit in first class. I had my ticket." The reply came almost instantly. "Dad, what do you mean they made you move?" Noah hesitated, then typed faster. "Noah, the flight attendant, she wouldn't listen." A long pause. Then, "Dad, what's the flight number?" Noah's fingers trembled slightly as he typed it out. His stomach twisted as he watched the message send. Another response. "Dad, stay where you are, I'll handle it." Noah exhaled, staring at the screen. He didn't know what his father meant, but something told him this wasn't over. Margaret strolled back to the galley, straightening her uniform with a satisfied nod. Another problem handled. She had worked these flights long enough to recognize when someone didn't belong. The boy wasn't rude, but she knew. First class wasn't for everyone. Behind her, a younger flight attendant, Lisa, placed a tray of glasses onto the counter. She had watched everything. The way Margaret never checked the system, never looked at the ticket properly. "Was there an issue with his boarding pass?" Lisa asked carefully. Margaret scoffed, adjusting her name tag. "Come on, Lisa, you saw him. Do you really think he paid for first class?" Lisa hesitated. She had worked plenty of flights, seen all kinds of passengers in first class, but something about Margaret's confidence unsettled her. "But you didn't check," Lisa said, her voice quieter now. Margaret waved a dismissive hand. "Trust me, I've been doing this for 15 years. I can tell who's supposed to be up here and who's not." Lisa pressed her lips together, her stomach twisting. She wanted to push back, to say something, but she knew better. Margaret had authority, and questioning her would only make trouble. Then the intercom crackled. "Margaret, Please report to the cockpit immediately. The air shifted. Flight attendants didn't get called up mid-service. Something was wrong. Margaret glanced at Lisa, then squared her shoulders and walked toward the front of the plane. She kept her posture straight, confident. Whatever it was, she could handle it. When she stepped into the cockpit, the atmosphere was tense. The captain stood near the control panel, arms crossed. But it was the screen on the in-flight phone that made Margaret's breath hitch. A man sat in a high-rise office, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His expression was unreadable, but the weight of his presence sent a chill down her spine. "Margaret," the man said, his voice calm but sharp, "do you know who I am?" Margaret swallowed. "No, sir." The captain shifted uncomfortably before speaking. "This is Mr. Carter, the owner of this airline." Margaret's stomach dropped. "You removed his son from first class," the captain continued, "without checking his ticket, without verifying his seat, without reason." Silence filled the cockpit. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Mr. Carter didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His next words made her knees weak. "You're going to walk back to economy and return my son to his seat," he said, his tone controlled. "And when this flight lands, you will explain yourself to the executive board." The line went dead. Margaret stood frozen, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The cockpit suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. She had handled difficult passengers before, made quick decisions without second-guessing herself. But this was something else. The captain didn't say a word, just gave her a pointed look before turning back to his controls. There was no room for argument, no way out. With stiff legs, Margaret stepped back into the main cabin, her grip tightening around the edges of her uniform. Passengers were still settled in their seats, lost in movies, books, or conversations, but she felt like they were all staring at her, even if they weren't. As she made her way toward economy, her pulse quickened. The boy, Noah, was easy to spot. He sat near the window, headphones in, staring out at the clouds like nothing had happened. She hesitated, then cleared her throat. "Excuse me, Noah." He didn't turn right away. Slowly, he pulled out one earbud and glanced at her. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said, voice quieter than before. "I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class." A few passengers shifted in their seats, eyes flickering toward them. They had seen what happened earlier. They remembered. Noah blinked, tilting his head slightly. "A misunderstanding?" Margaret forced a tight smile. "Yes, there was an error in seating." He didn't move, didn't argue, but he didn't stand either. His fingers tapped against his phone, then stilled. "I showed you my ticket," he said, voice calm. "You saw it." Margaret felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The silence around them grew heavier. "I may have made a mistake in judgment," she admitted, her voice lower now, "but I'd like to correct it." Noah studied her, his expression unreadable. The plane hummed softly around them. For the first time, Margaret felt something she wasn't used to: uncertainty. Noah reached for his phone. A second later, Margaret's work tablet vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out with shaky fingers and read the forwarded message from the airline's executive office. "Take your time, make her understand what she did." Her heart pounded. Noah glanced up at her again, waiting, and for the first time in her career, she didn't know how to respond. Margaret's fingers tightened around the tablet as she reread the message. Her mouth went dry. She had expected a simple correction: escort the boy back to first class, move on. But this meant facing the weight of her decision, something she wasn't prepared for. Noah hadn't moved. He wasn't defiant, wasn't angry. He was just waiting. His silence made her uneasy. Around them, a few passengers had turned their heads, pretending not to listen but clearly invested. Margaret started, but the words stuck. She had been so sure before, so confident in her authority. Now, for the first time, she felt small. Noah finally spoke, his voice even. "Why did you think I didn't belong in first class?" The question hung in the air. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. There were answers she could give, ones that would deflect, ones that would soften the truth. But none of them would erase what had already happened. She swallowed hard. "I made an assumption." Noah nodded slightly, like he was filing the response away. Then, without another word, he picked up his backpack and stood. The movement was slow, deliberate. He wasn't rushing to reclaim his seat. Margaret turned, leading him back through the aisle. This time she felt every pair of eyes on her. The same passengers who had stayed silent before were now watching closely. When they reached first class, Noah slid into his original seat without hesitation. He set his backpack at his feet, adjusting his hoodie. He didn't look at her, didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Margaret took a step back, hands clasped in front of her. She had expected relief once this was over. Instead, all she felt was a growing weight in her chest. She had done what was asked of her, but for the first time she wondered if that was enough. Margaret lingered near the front of the cabin, adjusting the cuffs of her uniform, pretending to check the passenger list, but her mind was somewhere else. The tension in her shoulders hadn't eased. If anything, it had settled in deeper. She had done what was required, returned the boy to his seat, admitted her mistake. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. She could still feel the stares, the unspoken judgment from those who had witnessed it all unfold. They weren't looking at her like a respected flight attendant anymore. They were looking at her like she was the problem. Noah, meanwhile, sat quietly in his seat, flipping through the in-flight magazine. He wasn't gloating, wasn't making a scene. He was simply there, exactly where he was supposed to be from the start. That somehow made it worse. Lisa approached, hesitating before speaking. "Are you okay?" she asked under her breath. Margaret stiffened. The question irritated her. "I'm fine." Lisa nodded but didn't move. "I think you should sit down." Margaret frowned. "Excuse me?" Lisa kept her voice low. "Just take a second. Breathe." Margaret bristled at the suggestion. She wasn't some nervous rookie who needed hand-holding. She had been in this job for years, but for the first time she felt unsteady, unsure of herself in a way she never had before. She exhaled sharply. "I don't need a break. I need to do my job." Lisa hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Okay," she said, stepping back. But the look on her face lingered, concern mixed with something else. Margaret turned away, smoothing her uniform, trying to regain control of herself. But deep down she knew this flight wasn't going to end like any other she had worked before. And the worst part, she had no one to blame but herself. Margaret moved through the aisle, but something had shifted. She had spent years walking these same narrow paths, weaving between seats, managing passengers with a practiced ease. But now, every step felt heavier. The air felt different. She stole a glance at Noah. He was flipping through the pages of the magazine like nothing had happened, but Margaret knew better. He wasn't ignoring what happened. He was processing it. And that was worse. A voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Excuse me." A man in a navy blazer sat in 4C, middle-aged, polished, someone who looked like he had spent his life in boardrooms and first-class lounges. He gestured for her to come closer. She forced a polite smile. "Yes, sir?" He studied her for a moment, then said, "I watched the whole thing." Margaret's stomach twisted. She had hoped people would let it go, that the moment would pass. But of course it hadn't. "I have to ask," the man continued, lowering his voice. "What exactly made you think that boy didn't belong here?" Margaret swallowed, keeping her expression neutral. "It was a mistake in judgment." The man didn't look convinced. "A mistake," he echoed. "You didn't even check his ticket." A few nearby passengers shifted in their seats. Margaret could feel their eyes on her. She kept her voice measured. "I've worked this job for 15 years. I take passenger security and comfort very seriously." The man didn't flinch. "You don't have to explain your resume to me. Just be honest with yourself. If his father hadn't intervened, would you have corrected your mistake?" Margaret's jaw tightened. She didn't have an answer for that. At least not one she wanted to say out loud. The man gave a slight nod as if he had already expected her silence. "That's what I thought." Then he leaned back in his seat and returned to his tablet. Margaret exhaled slowly, then turned away, heat creeping up her neck. She had handled difficult passengers before, entitled travelers, rude businessmen, frustrated parents. But this was different. This wasn't a confrontation. This was something far worse. This was accountability. She continued walking, but her steps felt heavier now. She had spent years believing she understood people, that her instincts were rarely wrong. But what if they were? For the first time, Margaret wasn't certain she liked the answer. The cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm. Passengers sipped their drinks, scrolled through their phones, or stared absently at the in-flight entertainment screens. But Margaret couldn't shake the tension gripping her chest. She had been in uncomfortable situations before, but this was different. This wasn't about an unruly passenger or a simple misunderstanding. This was about her. She lingered near the galley, pretending to organize trays, but her mind was elsewhere. The man in 4C's words echoed in her head. Would you have corrected your mistake if his father hadn't intervened? Margaret hated how quickly the answer had formed in her mind. Probably not. The realization unsettled her. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to read people, to control situations before they spiraled. But this time, she hadn't controlled anything. She had misjudged someone badly, and now for the first time she had to sit with that mistake. A soft voice pulled her back. Margaret? Lisa stood a few steps away, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Margaret straightened. Yes? Lisa hesitated, then said, I think you should talk to him. Margaret frowned. Who? Lisa gave her a knowing look. You know who? Margaret felt her throat tighten. She had already corrected the mistake. The boy was back in his seat. What more could she do? Lisa shifted her weight. You can do what you always do. Move on. Pretend it never happened. Or, you can be different this time. Margaret exhaled slowly. She had no excuse, no defense. She could tell Lisa to drop it, to mind her own business. But deep down, she knew Lisa was right. Without another word, Margaret turned and started walking back toward first class. Her pulse quickened with every step. This wasn't procedure. This wasn't required. This was something else entirely. Margaret stopped a few feet away from Noah's seat, her hands tightening into fists before she forced them to relax. The hum of the plane engines filled the space between them, a steady, quiet rhythm that gave her a second to gather herself. Noah hadn't noticed her yet. He was still flipping through the magazine, calm, composed, completely different from the boy she had sent to the back of the plane not long ago. But now that she was standing here, now that she had to face him without authority as a shield, she felt something foreign creeping into her chest. Regret. She cleared her throat. Noah glanced up, his expression unreadable. He didn't look angry, he didn't look smug. That almost made it worse. Margaret lowered her voice. I owe you an apology. Noah just watched her. He didn't rush to accept it. He didn't let her off easy. She hesitated, searching for the right words. I made an assumption. I didn't check, and that wasn't fair to you. A flicker of something crossed Noah's face. Curiosity, maybe, or quiet calculation. She forced herself to keep going. I don't expect you to forget it, but I want you to know I was wrong. Noah studied her for a long moment. Then slowly he leaned back in his seat, crossed his arms, and said, Okay. That was it. Not a dramatic moment, not a long-winded response, just one word. Margaret exhaled. She had braced herself for more. Anger, dismissal, maybe even the same coldness she had shown him. But instead, he gave her exactly what she had taken from him earlier. Dignity. For the first time that flight, she felt something shift inside her. Not shame, not humiliation, but understanding. As she turned to walk away, Noah spoke again. You won't forget this, will you? Margaret stopped. She didn't turn back, but a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of her lips. No, she said quietly. I won't. Then, as the plane began its descent, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected. Lighter. Like maybe for the first time, she had learned something she should have known all along.